When you take a walk through the picturesque streets of Vienna and look around carefully, you're inevitably going to stumble across a certain name many times. Dr. Karl Lueger. Numerous buildings in Austria's capital bear a plaque commemorating him. Some houses and fountains have been named after him, and there are numerous busts and monuments that have been erected in his honour. So he must undoubtedly have been a great man who contributed greatly to the development of Vienna. But there is also a different side to the story. If you take the U3 underground line and get off at Stubentor station, you will most likely come across the Karl Lueger monument. This monument is repeatedly the target of vandalism, and in May 2020 it was sprayed with several shame graffiti tags. Karl Lueger, mayor of Vienna between 1897 and 1910, is definitely one of the most controversial figures in Austrian history, and there is still a heated debate today about how he should be remembered. On the one hand, he was a talented local politician who knew how to present himself as a tribune of the people and develop Vienna into a truly European metropolis that became the envy of the whole world. Many of the qualities that make the city one of the most livable in the world today can be traced back to Lueger's initiatives. On the other hand, he was the first openly anti-Semitic mayor of a major European city. He was the textbook example of a demagogue and contributed greatly to making hatred of Jews socially acceptable. The hostility and agitation against Jews, which he used as a deliberate strategy for his political purposes, would have far-reaching consequences for the Jews of Austria. So, who was this man and how should he be judged? In this video, I will attempt to portray Karl Lueger in all of his aspects and explain his incredible success among the Viennese population. I will also provide the context for his anti-Semitic views and explain how hatred of Jews became so popular. But before we look at Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna, we must first examine his political career prior to his election. Karl Lueger was born in Vienna on the 24th of October 1844. After finishing high school, he enrolled at the University of Vienna to study law. In 1873, he passed his final exams and later opened up his law firm in the inner city. It was around that time that Lueger also became interested in politics. Initially, he was interested in the liberal parties, and his friend, the Jewish doctor Ignaz Mandl, convinced him to join the Liberal Citizens Club in the Landstraße district. Lueger quickly showed political talent, and in 1875 he was elected into the Municipal Council of Vienna. However, he resigned from the Municipal Council just 1 year later because he developed a rivalry with the mayor, Cajetan Felder, whom he repeatedly accused of corruption, embezzlement and incompetence. Still, he ran for office again, got re-elected, and this time managed to keep his post until the end of his life. He remained true to his liberal principles for several years, but that changed in 1882. He fell out with Ignaz Mandl and began to align himself with the petite bourgeoisie, i.e. the craftsmen, small traders, civil servants, teachers and clerks. These groups of people were more than dissatisfied with their economic situation. After Austria had become a constitutional monarchy in 1867, the liberals dominated political life for a very long time. Even after the stock market crash of 1873, they advocated for laissez-faire capitalism with as few restrictions as possible on entrepreneurs. They were generally blind to the social problems that such an economic system inevitably caused. They paid little attention to the concerns of the petite bourgeoisie, farmers and workers, which contributed greatly to their gradual decline. Lueger knew how to seize his opportunity. He concerned himself with the fate of impoverished craftsmen who could not compete with industrial mass production, businessmen who saw their livelihoods threatened by the new department stores, and small farmers whose property was increasingly being taken over by large landowners. However, and that's important to mention, Lueger did not wage a war against the rich, but tried to promote his program by diverting attention from abstract issues and making simple demands. Despite widespread industrialization, Vienna in the late 19th century remained a city dominated by middle-class businesses, and Lueger knew how to unite all of these groups under one banner. He presented himself as the politician of the common man, mobilizing their aspirations and desires and giving them a voice. In addition to anti-liberalism, antisemitism also became a unifying factor. I will discuss Lueger's anti-Semitism in more detail later, but suffice it to say that Jews were identified with industrial capitalism and seen as its driving force. As a result of this, the Jews were increasingly blamed for all the shortcomings and excesses of economic liberalism. This strategy proved to be extremely successful, and Lueger made his political breakthrough in the 1880s. In 1885, an electoral reform was introduced in Vienna, which significantly increased the political influence of the middle class. The annual tax that everyone had to pay to retain their right to vote was reduced to just 5 gulden. This enabled him to win a seat in the Imperial Council and further increase his popularity. In 1887, Lueger joined the anti-liberal Catholic Christian Social Association and quickly took over its leadership. Within just a few years, Lueger turned the initially small and insignificant association into a stable and respectable political party. The Christian Social Party enjoyed high popularity and achieved a clear majority in the elections to the Vienna City Council. The dominance of the liberals thus came to a rapid end. But Lueger wasn't done yet. He was an ambitious man and wanted to become mayor of Vienna as well. However, Lueger's enemies were not willing to give up so easily. Liberals, conservatives and high-ranking clergy gathered and decided to call for outside help. On behalf of the Austrian bishops, Cardinal Franz Schönborn presented the Pope with a formal complaint against Lueger and the Christian Socials. The party was not Catholic, but subversive, it claimed, inciting base desires and stirring up the passions of the people. Surprisingly, however, the complaint had the exact opposite effect. Pope Leo XIII was persuaded by the defense of the Christian Socials and gave Lueger his personal blessing. And so, in 1895, Lueger was elected mayor by the municipal council. However, Emperor Franz Joseph I, of all people, threw a spanner in the works. He rightly saw Lueger's antisemitism as a threat to the constitution, which guaranteed the equality of all citizens. Although the election was repeated, the emperor refused to swear Lueger in 3 more times. With each refusal, Lueger became more and more of a martyr and his number of votes grew. It was not until 2 years later that Franz Josef gave up his resistance. In view of the bloody riots that had broken out as a result of the language reforms of Prime Minister Kazimierz Bardini and the subsequent fear of revolution, Lueger was finally appointed mayor in 1897. To ease the tensions, Lueger swore his loyalty to the Kaiser and thus became his faithful servant. Lueger had made it. He had just secured the highest office in the Austrian capital, and his party held the majority of the seats in the municipal council. Vienna was now in the hands of a clerical, anti-liberal party, and with the church it had an important ally. In the municipal program, which he presented after his swearing in, Lueger called for the preservation of Christian values and the construction of more churches. The program was based on the Christian people, so the Catholic middle class, and focused exclusively on their wishes and rights. His entire election campaign had consisted of opposing the overpowering Jews and the liberals, and in this respect he remained true to his views even after the election. While his political promises obviously also played a huge role, it was mostly his charisma and his oratory skills which really made him so unbelievably popular and earned him the title of Tribune of the People. As I've mentioned before, Lueger's breakthrough came after the voting right was extended to encompass the middle class. Previously, politicians had paid no attention to that group because they didn't need to, and even after 1882, many still struggled to appeal to the new voter base. Most liberal politicians at that time were used to serving a more privileged, educated class. They placed great importance on their outward appearance, saw themselves as educators of the people, and spoke condescendingly from their ivory tower, which of course was not particularly well received. Lueger, on the other hand, knew extremely well how to appeal to them. He frequented beer halls, restaurants, market squares, and sought the contact of the people. He was a talented public speaker, gave his speeches in the local Viennese dialect, simplified the contemporary political discussions, and sometimes cracked jokes. He appealed to emotions and instincts, and relentlessly attacked the enemies of his voters. He lashed out against national and religious minorities, the rich up there, and the socialist revolutionaries. His lover, Marianne Beskiba, described in her diary just how captivating Lueger's oratory skills were. With flashing eyes and raised arms, gesticulating wildly, he let his voice boom out, which sounded somewhat muffled but left nothing to be desired in terms of power and clarity. He used strong words to describe the damage done by the previous liberal regime, developed his ideas for the general welfare for the people, and declared war on his opponents to the bitter end. Each sentence was met with thunderous applause, and he was often prevented from continuing by endless cheering. Drenched in sweat, he finally returned to his seat. Many politicians in Vienna at that time thought of political methods to deal with the masses, but none were as talented as Karl Lueger. A new era of political discourse had dawned, one marked by demagoguery, oversimplification, and scapegoating. The Austrian Social Democrat Friedrich Austerlitz summed up Lueger's strategy so precisely at the time that it has lost none of its relevance today. The career of this former lawyer is truly one of the most interesting phenomena of our political era. Examining and explaining it provides the key to understanding the psychology of the petite bourgeoisie. Lueger has enriched political science with a great discovery. He has transformed political democracy, this political movement that is dying of boredom, into modern demagogy, the art of persuading people that mere appearances are the essence of the matter. Today, Karl Lueger would probably be described as a populist, and indeed there are some parallels that can be drawn to today's populist movements. Lueger claimed to be the sole voice of the people and consistently agitated against a supposed liberal elite. He was not interested in constructive discussions, rejected the views of those who thought differently, and constantly insulted them. He created a clear bogeyman, namely the Jews, blamed them for social problems, and sought to exclude them from society. He created a cult around his personality, scored points with his charisma, and was mostly interested in gaining power. And once in power, he set about realizing his plan of completely reforming Vienna according to his vision. At around the turn of the century, Vienna was by far the largest city in Austria, and it counted a bit more than 1.7 million people. By 1910, that number had grown to over 2 million, partially due to a high birth rate and migration from other parts of the Habsburg Empire, especially the Czech lands. This rapidly growing metropolis needed to quickly adapt to the new circumstances. It needed a better transport network, a supply in gas, electricity and water, new schools, healthcare and much more. He launched a series of highly propagandistic municipalization measures. As a result, the city of Vienna took over numerous formerly privately owned capitalist enterprises that had often been managed by foreign entrepreneurs. Within a few years, municipal gas and electricity works were opened. Vienna's transport system was also to be operated by the city. In 1903, the trams were transferred to public ownership, whereupon the rail network was considerably expanded. However, the greatest achievement in transport under Lueger was undoubtedly the city railway. The architect of this idea, Otto Wagner, had already drawn up his plan under the Liberal government, but was only able to implement it under Lueger. 4 railway lines now ran through the city, connecting the suburbs with the centre, which allowed people to freely and quickly navigate through the metropolis. In 1910, the second Vienna Mountain Spring Pipeline was built, which still supplies the capital with cool, fresh water from the Hochschwabe region, almost 200 kilometers away. Lueger was also concerned with social welfare, founding a municipal life and pension insurance scheme, a central savings bank, and expanding the central cemetery. But Vienna was also expanded in terms of construction. In Linz, for example, a care home was built, a complex of 29 pavilions equipped with the latest technology, including lighting systems, electric lifts, and a functional telephone network. At that time, it was the most modern healthcare facility in the world. A magnificent church was also built on the site, just for good measure. But why did Lueger do all this? It was certainly not because he was a convinced socialist reformer. After all, the group of people that profited the most from his municipalization measures was the petite bourgeoisie, and it mostly improved their daily lives. That way he appealed to their anti-capitalist sentiment, gained their favour, and secured himself a place in history. Another reason was a financial nature. Lueger wanted to make Vienna as fiscally independent from the central government as possible. The earnings of all these city-owned businesses flowed directly into the city coffers and made up a substantial amount of the yearly budget. And the final reason was the preservation of his and his party's power. He knew his voter base very well and wanted to make them dependent on him. In order to secure one of the highly sought-after contracts for the numerous construction projects in Vienna, one had to be a member of the Christian Social Party, or at least be well disposed towards it. The same applied to scholarships and municipal housing. This allowed Lueger's voters to feel like the chosen ones under the protection of the tribune of the people and to distinguish themselves from the other social classes in the city. Lueger made no secret of the fact that he felt obliged only to his supporters. I am responsible only to my voters, responsible only to those municipal councillors who have given me their vote. As a direct result, the numerous Viennese workers often got the short end of the stick. He could afford to do so because the working class had very little political power due to the unjust Curia voting system. After Lueger was authorized in 1909 to make all financial decisions on his own, there were repeated fierce disputes between the workers and the middle class, even though both groups were fundamentally anti-capitalist. For example, Lueger unconditionally supported the Viennese butchers and tolerated their artificially inflated meat prices. The same applied to bakers who charged extortionate prices for their bread. In response, the Social Democrats founded the Hammerbrotwerke and produced affordable bread, which they distributed throughout the city. This led to fierce outrage on the part of the Christian socials, who defamed the Hammerbrotwerke as a Jewish big business enterprise that endangered the honest baker's trade. At this point, you might ask yourself how Karl Lueger even managed to finance all of this. The answer is very simple. He took on giant amounts of debt. By 1913, the amount of debt, including interest, was triple that of the annual city budget. Lueger never intended repaying these loans in his lifetime and stuck to the tax policy that had already been established by the previous liberal government. This placed a particularly heavy burden on the low-income population, who received almost nothing in return. The majority of the Vienna city budget was spent on urban infrastructure, while social services were neglected. Expenditure on healthcare was in the single-digit percentage range, little money was invested in the expansion of swimming pools and parks, and there were virtually no measures to alleviate social hardship. Investments were made at most in poorhouses because Christian charity dictated that at least a minimum subsistence level should be provided. Everything above that was left to the individual, with the Christian socials following the liberal credo in this respect too. Under Lueger, virtually no steps were ever taken to alleviate the housing shortage, which often forced people to live in overpriced rental barracks in unimaginably miserable conditions, if they even had their own flat. This is hardly surprising, as landlords had long been an important bloc in the municipal council. They consistently opposed any intervention in the privately capitalist housing market, whether it be building regulations, planning projects, or tenants' rights. So, while the plight of the working class continued to grow, Lueger enjoyed almost godlike popularity among his supporters in the petite bourgeoisie. Certainly, Lueger's great popularity was also due to infrastructural developments. Another important factor, however, was the cult of personality that he and his supporters created around the mayor. One example of this is the Reichspost, the independent daily newspaper for the Christian people of Austria-Hungary. It was one of the most widely read newspapers in Vienna and the unofficial mouthpiece of the Christian Social Party. The Reichspost stood firmly behind Lueger and portrayed him as some sort of messiah who protected the Viennese Catholics from the evil forces of the Jews, the capitalists, and the socialists. Another organisation that was crucial to his success was the highly organised Christian Viennese Women's League, founded in 1897. The Women's League was not a feminist organisation. It did not fight for women's suffrage or equal rights, but it was closely associated with the Christian Social Party. It was crucial in Lueger's electoral success, organising marches through Vienna during which the women chanted "Long live Lueger" and spreading Christian social propaganda. Lueger was always keen on making himself popular with women in particular. He kept his love affair with Marianne Beskiba secret and presented himself as an unattainable bachelor whose only love was Vienna. Lueger also knew that he was handsome and played this up deliberately. He had a reputation for being a womanizer and knew how to flatter women. He liked to tell them that they had a great influence on their husbands and that they should convince them to vote for the Christian Social Party in the next local elections. Beskiba herself cynically referred to Lueger's female supporters as his harem. The Vienna Museum has collected some 4,000 artifacts over the years that demonstrate just how far-reaching and absurd Lueger's cult of personality was. A whole new industry had appeared that solely focused on producing Lueger kitsch. How about a Lueger pipe or a Lueger hat manufactured precisely to the shape of Lueger's favourite hat? or maybe a Lueger beer mug or some Lueger coins are more to your liking. And if you're hungry, you can feast on some Lueger bread. Perhaps you'd be more interested in acquiring a life-sized Lueger portrait for the low price of just 50 crowns. Lueger himself also received a lot of presents from his grateful supporters, like this silver-plated iron wreath from the Catholic Constitutional Association in Wieden, or this highly ornamented birthday wish from the Christian associations of Leopoldstadt-Brigittenau. The aforementioned Women's League also showed Lueger its infinite gratitude with a silver cup and a gold-plated laurel wreath. In the late 1890s, Lueger's followers organised countless dance events and balls dedicated solely to him. At the beginning of a ball, women were usually presented with a small gift, a so-called ball donation, which often bore Lueger's likeness. These were often elaborately crafted and enjoyed enormous popularity. But enough of all that. I think it's finally time to talk about Lueger's instrumentalization of anti-Semitism. Like in other countries, anti-Semitism took hold in Austria towards the end of the 19th century. Unlike in the past, this was not based primarily on Christian stereotypes about Jews, but on a completely new conception of what Jews were. In Vienna in particular, religion played only a minor role for most Jews, and there was even a widespread tendency towards assimilation. Many people with a Jewish background described themselves primarily as German or Austrian, and often even converted to Christianity. However, this step did not protect them from modern anti-Semitism, which understood Judaism not as a religion, but as a race. So even if a Jew converted, he was still a Jew in the eyes of anti-Semites. This view was based primarily on social Darwinism, which decreed that humanity was engaged in a constant struggle for survival in which only the strongest could prevail. The most famous radical anti-Semite was Georg von Schönerer, who, however, never succeeded in turning hostility towards Jews into a mass movement. Karl Lueger would be the first to achieve this. Still, Lueger and the Christian socials advocated for a different form of anti-Semitism than Schönerer. Ever since the reformation of Austria into a constitutional monarchy in 1867, the Catholic Church had lost more and more of its power. Under the liberal governments in the 1860s, civil marriages were legalized and responsibility over divorce proceedings was transferred over to the state. Later, all schools in Austria were nationalized. In response to this, Catholic spokesmen began to look for someone to blame, and they quickly found their scapegoat: the Jews. They increasingly identified the Jews for all aspects of modernity they despised: secularization, liberalism, democracy, capitalism, and Marxism. The perfect example of this is the influential Catholic politician Karl von Vogelsang. In his newspaper Vaterland, he described capitalism as a Jewish invention which sought to destroy the moral fabric of society. He argued for a complete Christianization of society and spread fear about a supposed Jewish domination. But unlike Schönerer, most Catholic anti-Semites did not attack the Jews on a racial basis, but rather called on them to see the error of their ways and convert to Catholicism. In his hometown of Vienna, which had a significant Jewish population, almost 9% at the turn of the century, Lueger used precisely these arguments to win over voters. He was heavily influenced by Vogelsang's writing, and he combined this Catholic worldview with populist anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism. The Christian Social Party made it clear that the Jewish question was highly important, but it rejected both the racial and traditionally religious forms of anti-Semitism, instead opting for a political and economic approach. Lueger intentionally used anti-Jewish agitation to appeal to a wider audience, to which the economically struggling craftsmen and traders were especially susceptible. Many of the newly opened factories and department stores were owned by Jews, and many Jewish immigrants from poverty-struck eastern Galicia worked as peddlers in Vienna. The middle class hoped, due to their very lacking understanding of economics, that anti-Semitic policies might solve all their problems, and Lueger was quick to give them that illusion. He united all enemy stereotypes into one simple formula: the Jew is at fault. He railed relentlessly against the money and stock market Jews, the press Jews, the ink Jews, the Social Democratic Jewish Protection Force, the Eastern European beggar Jews, and Jewish modern art and the women's movement. Lueger and the Christian socials advocated for a reduction of the power of the Jews and the reversal of Jewish emancipation and legal equality of 1867. In a speech he gave in Vienna in 1899, he spread conspiracy theories under thunderous applause. In Vienna, Poor craftsmen have to go begging on Saturday afternoons to make use of their skills, begging from Jewish furniture dealers. The influence of the masses is in the hands of the Jews. Most of the capital, especially large-scale capital, is in Jewish hands, and the Jews are practicing a form of terrorism that is beyond belief. Our main concern in Austria is the liberation of the Christian people from the domination of Judaism. We want to be free men on the soil of our fathers, and the Christian people should rule where our fathers shed their blood. Lueger became particularly aggressive when discussions turned to so-called ritual murders. This is an age-old medieval rumour accusing Jews of killing Christian children for their blood. Around the turn of the century, the ritual murder legend experienced a sad revival, and whenever a child or a young woman was murdered in the rural areas of the Habsburg Empire, it was brought up again, as was the case in Tisza in Hungary or Polna in Bohemia, for example. In a session of the Imperial Council, Lueger said, "It happens that Jews use blood contrary to their prohibition, or rather have stained themselves with blood. It happened in the past, can't it happen again now? Well, I am of the opinion that it is not the Jews who are the martyrs of the Germans, but the Germans who are the martyrs of the Jews. Wolves, lions, panthers, leopards, tigers are humans compared to these predators in human form." Lueger also had no problem threatening Jews with violence. In a session of the Imperial Council, a liberal Jewish member of parliament protested against anti-Semitic agitation and recalled a statement by Lueger where he said that he was indifferent whether Jews were hanged or shot. Lueger replied impassively, "Beheaded, that is what I said." That remark was before his term as mayor, but even afterwards he did not exactly hold back. When pogroms against Jews broke out in southern Russia and Ukraine in 1905, which resulted in thousands of deaths, Lueger spoke at a voters' meeting. "I warned the Jews most earnestly. What happened in Russia could happen here. We in Vienna are anti-Semites, but we are certainly not capable of murder and manslaughter. However, if the Jews threaten our fatherland, then we too will show no mercy." Interestingly, Lueger never went beyond empty threats and polemical anti-Jewish rants during his term in office. The most he did was to make it difficult for Jews to get municipal contracts and to enter public service. He never passed any anti-Jewish legislation, and physical violence against Jews remained a very rare phenomenon. There are some explanations for this. One factor was certainly Kaiser Franz Joseph, who never grew a liking to the Viennese demagogue and kept a close eye on him in order to safeguard the constitution. Another factor was that the main reason for the growth in anti-Semitism, economic stagnation and hardship, was no longer present as Austria experienced a booming economy after around 1900. Mayor Lueger instead focused on his modernization of the city and only used anti-Jewish hatred as a rhetoric. The decline of popularity in anti-Semitism is best demonstrated by the election results. In 1907, the free, equal and secret voting right to the Imperial Council was introduced for all men, and the Christian Socials couldn't profit nearly as much as the Social Democrats, who were able to increase their numbers of seats almost ninefold. In the municipal elections in the year after Lueger's death in 1911, the Christian Socials suffered a heavy defeat against the Social Democrats, despite the skewed voting system. There is an ongoing debate among historians whether Lueger was indeed a convinced anti-Semite, or if he just exploited anti-Jewish stereotypes for political purposes. Looking at some sources, the latter seems to be the more likely explanation. His famous remark, "I decide who is a Jew," which he made to justify his association with some wealthy Viennese Jews, definitely points in that direction. But if anything, that just makes it worse, because all that remains of Lueger now, apart from his personal charm and his oratory skills, is an empty shell of a politician without any sort of moral beliefs or convictions. Many contemporaries also saw it that way. Wilhelm Ellenbogen, a leading Jewish Austrian socialist, argued that Lueger's Jew baiting was nothing more than a fraud and a socialism of fools, which attempted to manipulate the dissatisfied petite bourgeoisie into following a demagogue in his meaningless struggle against the Jewish capital. Friedrich Austerlitz also argued that Lueger's anti-Semitism was just a con. He only attacks the Jews, that is, the attack has no specific goal, it is an end in itself and degenerates into demagogy. Of course, it didn't matter to the Jews in Vienna, who were outraged nonetheless that Lueger made anti-Semitism a part of his politics, contrary to his convictions, if there were any. Sigmund Meyer, a Jewish businessman, wrote in his memoirs, "The man lacked the most basic trait that makes a person, honesty. His anti-Semitic views were always completely hypocritical. I'm not accusing you of being anti-Semitic, but rather of not being anti-Semitic. What Lueger may have thought about Jews in private and the fact that he never directly harmed anyone is completely irrelevant. His tirades and hate speech were intended to have a long-lasting effect. On the one hand, they led many Jews to mistakenly believe that the tirades of an angry demagogue could be safely ignored, as he would never actually carry out his threats anyway. On the other hand, he deliberately poisoned the atmosphere and made anti-Semitism socially acceptable, if not a legitimate political tool. He deliberately spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, threatened with violence, and portrayed Jews as the eternal enemies of the Christian Vienna. In doing so, he contributed greatly to turning hatred of Jews into a mass phenomenon, which would have disastrous consequences several decades later. And the fact that he did this primarily to further his own political career is doubly reprehensible. There is one final aspect of Lueger's political work that I would like to touch upon, namely his Germanization policy. Around 1900, Vienna was a multinational city, a melting pot made up of all parts of the Habsburg monarchy. Overall, only around half of the population came from Vienna itself or the surrounding areas of Lower Austria. The rest, apart from 170,000 foreigners, came from the other Austrian crownlands. The predominantly Czech-speaking crownlands of Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia stand out in particular. Vienna thus had a significant Czech minority, whose presence quickly made itself felt. Many Viennese people were far from pleased with this development and felt they were facing a Slavic flood that threatened the German character of the city. Initially, the Czech minority had largely supported Lueger as they welcomed his anti-Semitic agitation. Shortly after his election as mayor, the tide turned rather quickly and Lueger implemented a policy of Germanization. He most likely exploited the German-Czech dispute, which had been further exacerbated by the Badeni riots, to make himself more popular with German nationalists. Immediately after taking office, he railed against the private Czech elementary school in the Favoriten district, which had been founded in 1883 and was under the authority of the Komensky School Association. I would like to clarify that I have never been in favour of the Komensky school, never advocated for it, never worked for it. We will be able to resolutely defend ourselves against the foolish Czechs, if I may put it that way, and I assure the honourable interpellant that he will find me at the forefront of this defence. You cannot compete with Dr. Lueger when it comes to Germanness. I am proud to come from an old German farming family. In 1900, Lueger prescribed a new oath that people had to take if they wanted to obtain Viennese citizenship. From that point on, every applicant, provided they met the already strict conditions, had to swear before the mayor that they would do their utmost to uphold the German character of the city. This directly required new citizens not to belong to any Czech associations and not to speak Czech in their everyday lives. If the applicant refused, they were denied citizenship. And if they lied, they could be prosecuted for perjury under certain circumstances. During Lueger's term in office, Czechs often faced everyday hostility, and numerous motions were discussed in the municipal council to keep Czechs out of the labour market. The recognition of a very vague anti-German sentiment was often sufficient grounds for dismissal or refusal of employment. However, Lueger's Vienna was by no means alone in taking such measures. The period was marked by nationalist conflicts, and many national majorities deliberately attempted to nationalize their capitals. Budapest rigorously Magyarized immigrants, Prague became increasingly a Czech city, Lemberg, Lwów or Lviv was transformed by the ruling Polish elite into the most important centre of Polish culture and a substitute capital for the long-lost Polish state, and Trieste was regarded by the Italians as their city. And these are just a few examples. Lueger also had the political wisdom not to completely demonize the Viennese Czechs. He supported assimilated immigrants under his motto, "Leave my Bohemians alone." He appointed assimilated Czechs to high positions and made the Czech-born petite bourgeoisie his loyal supporters. As with the Germans, Lueger also enjoyed a high degree of admiration among them, and they saw him as the chosen one who would free their hometown from Jewish capitalist influences. When Karl Lueger died of diabetes in 1910, he had ruled and shaped Vienna for a total of 13 years. His funeral was a mass spectacle, and thousands of Viennese mourned the loss of the People's Tribune. Shortly after his death, his body was taken to the cemetery church at Vienna's Central Cemetery, where it remains to this day. For the Christian socials, Lueger's death was a disaster, as the party had no real program and for decades had clung only to Lueger's personality, who himself was merely a political shell. After the fall of the Habsburg monarchy, the Social Democrats took over the city administration in Vienna, and the cult surrounding Lueger declined significantly. The only exception was the Lueger monument, which had been decided upon shortly after Lueger's death, but could not be unveiled until 1926 due to the war years and financial difficulties. Under Austro-fascism in the 1930s, which was primarily carried by the Christian socials, Lueger once again became an important figure of identification. A section of the Ring Road was renamed Dr. Karl Lueger Ring, and a 2-shilling coin bearing his likeness was issued. Even after the Anschluss, the old mayor remained an important symbolic figure. Adolf Hitler highly admired Lueger and regarded him as a formative figure in his political career. During his stay in Vienna between 1908 and 1913, he learned a lot of lessons from the governing mayor. Not necessarily in a political sense, as Hitler identified much more with Schönerer's racial antisemitism and rejected Lueger's populist pseudo-antisemitism. He also despised Lueger's loyalty to the Habsburgs and his Christian social worldview. But he learned a lot from Lueger's political skills and oratory abilities. Hitler adopted Lueger's strategy of appealing to the masses with emotions, simple solutions and rabble-rousing. He confirmed his followers' beliefs that they were threatened by a greater power and presented himself as their savior, their Führer. The young Hitler had learned the art of demagogy from none other than Lueger. Under National Socialism, Lueger's role as mentor to the Führer was particularly emphasized. This culminated in 1943 in the propaganda film Vienna 1910, shot in Vienna, which showed the last 3 days in the life of the Viennese mayor. After 1945, Lueger no longer enjoyed cult status, but memories of him and his time were treated completely uncritically in Austria for a long time. This was entirely in keeping with the spirit of the times, as other unpleasant aspects of Austrian history, above all National Socialism and the extermination of European Jews, were deliberately swept under the carpet in the post-war period. For a long time, Lueger's anti-Semitism was excused by contrasting it with his municipal projects. It was not until the 1990s that a more nuanced examination of the former mayor took place, even if it continues to divide opinions. The current debate revolves primarily around the massive Lueger monument and what should be done with it. There have been heated discussions about this for years, but no wholly satisfactory solution has yet been reached in Vienna. Large sections of the Jewish community are calling for the memorial to be demolished, as are some activists. Others see this as counterproductive, because removing historically controversial objects would make history invisible and suppress it. This would suggest a perfect world, and of course, the world isn't perfect. Still others, particularly from the right-wing scene, continue to idolize Lueger and view him as a role model. The city of Vienna organized an artistic competition to better contextualize the memorial. The jury ultimately chose a design which proposes tilting the memorial by 3.5 degrees. According to the artist Clemens Wilidahl, this change is intended to break the claim to monumentality, spark controversy, and to keep the debate alive. The monument will be dismantled, cleaned, restored, and tilted. The entire process is scheduled for completion in autumn 2025 at the earliest, and will cost approximately €500,000. Whatever one may think of this suggestion, one thing is certain: Lueger continues to be a hotly debated topic. I have no doubt that the question of his legacy will continue to occupy us for years to come. At the very least, I hope that with this video I have presented a somewhat complete picture of Karl Lueger, and that it helps you to understand the context behind Karl Lueger's success and what consequences emotionally oriented mass politics have. In our post-factual era dominated by misinformation and divisiveness, this is more important to understand than ever before. Okay then, dankeschön for watching until the end. As you might think, making these videos is very difficult and time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier, a number of other very sweet benefits. In any case, I want to thank my invaluable supporters, without whom none of this would even be possible. Marius Gerling, Ian York, Leader Titan, Grünkohlfresser, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, Philip Marchewka, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Süderizer, Lyle Furphy, Yin, William, Big Dave, Folling and Third Hand Bone. Have a very nice day and see you next time.